Sociocultural Impact, a conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization, power relations and sociocultural impact, a conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their war? They be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization, power relations and sociocultural impact, a conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media, a conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? The cultural impact, a conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March.
Dear colleagues, experts, students, good afternoon. We will continue the sessions of this valuable conference. This second session will look into the economic interests and cultural wars of social media networks. As noticed, the main topics of this session cover economic interests, cultural wars, and social media networks. This triangulation is similar to the equation of weapon companies as we are shedding light on the monopoly by social media networks of information and also monopoly in the media production and the withholding of wide data and what is known as also the engineering of users. This is similar in politics to the engineering of elections and influence thereof by states. We will also look into hate speech on social media and the expression that is widespread now, especially when it comes to ideological polarization. This is a very enriching topic or session in its topics, and specifically with the panelists. Allow me to welcome Mr. Guy Berger, Mrs. Fatima Zahra Sayed, Mr. Winston Mano, Mr. Nuruddin Miladi. And I would like to start with Mr. Guy Berger, who will be addressing social media monopoly, hate speech, and cultural wars. Each panelist will have 10 minutes so that we use the remaining time for discussions. You have the floor, Dr. Gieberger.
Shukran, shukran, salam alaikum. Okay, thank you, Professor Basumi. It's much a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody. I thought to start by defining hate speech because I worked at UNESCO for 10 years, and there in the UN system, they want to have a lot of clarity about these definitions. So you might know ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It says that there's freedom of expression, but the other abuse of expression to incite discrimination, hostility, or violence should be outlawed. This is in the International Covenant. Of course, we find that even though it should be outlawed, often people are still doing it. So we have a problem there. The case with that kind of incitement to violence does not have to be on a hate basis, but if it is identifying a group of people, then it's a kind of a hate speech. So that is how we're working on it at UNESCO. And you can see these three things: discrimination, hostility, violence. So even if you don't have violence, you can still have hate speech. You can have incitement to hostility, that's hate speech. But often they start with the one and they move to the next, You can see that this is also based on human rights on the slide there, that discrimination is violating your right to equality, hostility is your right to safety, and violence is your right to life. So when we come a bit further, we can see that in some contexts, like my own country, there used to be a law under apartheid where they said if you criticize white domination, that is hate speech. So we have real hate speech, and then we have the use of hate speech to suppress legitimate speech, legitimate criticism of apartheid. And further, I would say, I'm not sure why this thing is not moving. I don't know if I've got it plugged in here. Anyway. Sorry, let me just try and get that. Anyway, I'll just carry on talking. Not all expressions of hatred is hate speech, because first it must be incitement to violence, discrimination, and so on. It's working here, but it's not showing there. Okay, well, I'll carry on talking while this is loading because of time. So if I say I hate racism and I hate this person because this person is being racist, that is not hate speech. If I say I hate xenophobia, anti-immigrants, then it's the same thing. Okay, so this I covered already. All right, so I continue. So understanding the hatred. Hate speech is used sometimes, the term hate speech sometimes misused to suppress not hate speech. And then you have this question that not all expression of hate is hate speech. So it's fine if you are saying, I hate xenophobia, I hate this, I hate even invading soldiers, like if you're in Ukraine. But if you say it's against a whole group of people, then it is hate speech. So if you were to say, I hate all members of this ethnic group because they're racist, that is hate speech, because you're generalizing. If you said, I hate all Russians because of the invasion of Ukraine by the president, on the orders of the president, that is hate speech. And now, this is important because social media, they have policies on hate speech, but they don't understand them. Facebook said after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we will suspend our policy on hate speech. But is this fine? Is it fine to say all Russians must die? Of course not. But that's what they did by saying, you know, they would lift their policy on hate speech then. They have a different policy, incitement to violence. They could have lifted that policy because you can incite to national defense. That's fine in terms of international law. Anyway, so this is why I'm important I like to make these points. And at the same time, we also have to remember that where there are expressions of hatred, it's not just in the communication system, it's also linked to the real situation on the ground where people can be mobilized. Anyway, my point here is that hate speech is not an answer to hate speech. Okay? Now, let's see where culture fits into this. So, we have this notion, culture is upstream from politics. This is what the famous Steve Bannon said when he was supporting Trump's election campaign. So, when you're working upstream in culture, you create this sense of fear and anger and the others, and you try to build that identity against those people. And then you can have downstream actual attacks, and you can have things like laws being passed to discriminate against people. You can have threats of harm. At the extreme, you can even have genocide. And then, before I jump into the platforms, I want to say that hate speech is not the same as disinformation. As you saw with the COVID vax, it's disinformation. It's not always hatred. Sometimes it's hatred towards the vaccinated. But usually, COVID disinformation was not hate-based. But often you find hate is using lies, falsehoods to strengthen its case. So we should just distinguish between these also, because hate speech is illegal in international law. But to tell a lie is not, except in some circumstances. I won't go into that now. So I turn now to the internet companies. So I did a study here, you can see it there, just very recently for UNESCO, and it's online there. And I was looking at many of these questions. Digital vector, it means the channels by which, in this case, hate speech travels. So I found lots of evidence here. There's one case that 7 million, in just 5 months, 7 million cases, mainly on Twitter, against LGBTQ, people with disabilities, French Arab communities. 50% of Holocaust references on Telegram involve soft hate, moving into hard hate. In South Africa, my country, in 2022, there's very much a danger of attacks on immigrants. Many immigrants have been killed. And here you see on social media that here, as you may know, under Elon Musk, hate speech has really been growing on Twitter. More evidence, you know that, of course, in Myanmar, this is the famous case recognized by the UN that Facebook was used to commit the genocide against the Rohingya people. And in 2021, they still found that on Facebook there's still hate against Rohingya people. On TikTok, there's another problem there that I mentioned. And then again on TikTok, white nationalist content is also being expressed there. So this is a glimpse of some of the way you see hate on this. Why is hate on the platforms? First of all, amplification, which has been spoken about. So we know that the business model logic is to get your attention and keep you there because they can get your data and they can sell advertising. That's the reason. The rage it creates, the more people stick to it. So that's what the algorithms are doing. The more hateful you can be, the more you will get responses and the more longer people are staying on the platform. So I say curational design because there's curation and moderation. Moderation is something else to creation. Creation, I'll give you a quick example. If you go into a big supermarket, curation is you walk like this, you see the chocolate here, you see something, a bargain there, you get to the cash. They organize the experience like at the airport with the duty free. You have to go through, that's curation. If there's a person there cleaning the floor, keeping security, that's moderation. But basically, curation is the fundamental. Moderation is coming on top of it and second to that. And so moderation is trying to reduce a bit the damage caused by the curation. Okay. The model of this business model involves trying to nudge you a little bit because they're trying to sell your behavioral future. And this is very powerful for identity and for hate. Because if they try to take you as an ordinary person and say, let's go and hate these immigrants and go and beat them or whatever, you will say, you won't normally do it. But bit by bit, you see, this is where the nudging comes in. They begin to get you. And it's not a matter of fact-checking. It's not right or wrong. It's a matter of it's not of true or false. It's a matter of what is created to think about is right and wrong. And so what they try to do is get your heart to become the driving force. So that even if you get other information that contradicts, you stay prejudiced, you stay with hate in your heart. That's the aim of those who use it. A second reason why you get this in the internet is because of money, of course. The first, we know the platforms, the companies, they don't spend. In 2020, Facebook gave 13% of its budget to look for misinformation outside of the US. And then they have the advertising, and advertising is automatic. And so what this means is that it's easy to put an advertisement with hate in it into the platforms because nobody's checking it. It's a computer system that just takes it. And then that computer system can micro-target it. So somebody who's interested in white nationalism can get a thing saying, oh, you're a white person, now you must hate black people, so, for example. And then the system also means that money goes to the platform, it makes money from selling adverts, but often the platform promoting this content is also producing money for the haters, for these hate actors. Let's look at these hate actors, the haters. They're very well organized. Research by Oxford Internet Institute said that 45 countries were organizing this computational propaganda. Some of it is disinformation, some of it is conspiracy, but some is hate. Facebook said it took down 200 covert influence operations. Not all of those influence operations are hate. Sometimes it's just disinformation, but hate is in some of them. In South Africa, again, there was what they call a dangerous narrative, orchestrated narrative that whipped up anti-immigrant sentiment from a propaganda machine of 80 connected Twitter accounts that led to 50,000 other accounts. And these haters, the internet owners, the platforms, they say, these are the bad actors. But the bad actors can be bad because the platforms have what you can call affordances, the facilities, the tools for them to be active on these. And then the companies don't do enough to stop it. And companies are working individually. Facebook here, TikTok there, Instagram there. But somebody's organizing a hate is working on all these. But because the companies are fragmented, they don't coordinate a response. So the haters also are quite sophisticated. They can exploit things. For example, Facebook said, okay, we don't allow white supremacy, but we do allow white nationalism. I'm sorry, white nationalism is a code word for white supremacy and is a kind of racism. The haters, they know that AI is not good enough to find hate, because hate requires context. If you're going to actually really say, is this reportage, a news report, or is it real hate? AI can't do that. So these people can exploit that. And then, quite often, legitimate content can be blocked, but at the same time, the haters, they use visuals. It's more difficult for AI to interpret a visual than text. They are creating synthetic media, that's deep fakes, and they use dog whistles. So instead of saying, let's go and hit the immigrants, they use some code word like the cockroaches need to be stamped out. And then the AI is not finding that. So those are some of the reasons why the platforms have this problem on them. So to touch on two last points, the media and civil society, I think we can say thank goodness for the media, because this is what is monitoring, telling the story of this online. It's calling for the accountability of the haters and of the platforms. They sometimes are digging into where is this hate coming from. It's not just ordinary people, it's being mobilized as a conspiracy. And they expose that the platforms are not doing enough. They also raise the public media and information literacy and generate counter content. So because this is also an event by Al Jazeera, the stream is a very good example of counter hate content. So the media can also help people identify that hate is not the answer. That if you have a problem, it's not the immigrants you must attack. You must actually say the government should do a better job. So the media can do this. That media can tell people a hate campaign is a false ride. It's not going to take you to a solution. And it's violating the rights of your fellow people. Okay, last point about regulation. Private sector actors, in terms of the UN principles, they should be respecting human rights. Big platforms, small platforms. And this is also not only the platforms as we know them, but these other levels of what you call the tech stack, app stores. And regulation needs to somehow get this respect for human rights across all these actors, and to also say it's a matter of consumer protection. Because the companies, when you go and use their services, they say this is a safe environment. But then they don't stop hate. So this is a question then of their consumer promise. Up to date, the system is, some people say self-regulation, I call it solo regulation, so do other people. Platforms, they're self-governing, they decide their own story. But now things are moving, because it got so bad on these big platforms that now you're moving to a hybrid regulation with regulation of the companies, co-regulation, industry-wide self-regulation, and multi-stakeholder regulation. And this should really be coming to all the rules around hate speech, setting the rules, monitoring the rules, evaluating. And at the same time, I come back to what I mentioned earlier, that there's a risk. Because political actors are implicated in doing hate speech, we have to be careful if it's a problem of solo government regulation replacing solo platform regulation. And many regulators are not independent. And many small countries have this problem, that How are they going to actually regulate these big international companies? And we know that there are laws and the application of laws that criminalize not hate speech, but legitimate speech under the name, they criminalize under the name of fighting hate speech. And there's penalties that are too severe. Anyway, I won't go into that because of time. This is my last slide. So we have a laissez-faire situation, which is what we have had before. That's one bad situation. If we went to unilateral government control, that's also not necessarily a solution to hate speech. So we need to look at these other options, including multiple stakeholders. That's academia, media, the civil society, religious organizations, you name it, all being involved in a holistic and systemic way. And one of the key things that is needed is that the companies have to be required to do due diligence. So if they see that there's something beginning to happen, or there's an election that will happen and that is going to lead to conflict, they need to predict and have foresight what is the chance of hate speech, what's the chance of disinformation, and plan in advance what action they will take. So UNESCO has this conference, that I did this research for, trying to have principles that will fix hate speech in that. And then in 2024, next year, the UN is organizing what they call Summit for the Future. And they are developing, the UN in New York, Global Code of Conduct, Global Digital Compact. And if you have those three things, UNESCO and the UN, and if you have media and civil society continuing to engage, then I think we can counter the hate speech online. But if these things don't work, we are in big trouble. Thank you. شكرا شكرا.
برجل وهذا العرض تضمن الكثير من القضايا.
Many important issues touched upon in this presentation, including an accurate definition of hate speech, in addition to talking about social media platforms being a very fertile environment for hate speech, such as systemic hate, which is worthy of being further explored. We would like to say that Mr. Guy Berger is an independent media and internet policy consultant. He worked with the UNESCO on press freedom, and also he worked with the UN on the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists. We move now to our second panelist, Mrs. Fatima Zahra Sayed. She is a professor of journalism in Cairo.
And she's going to talk about ideological polarization between Hindus and Muslims on TikTok. She also has a very important resume. And I'm not going to go through the biographies in order to make the best use of the time. You have the floor, Dr. Fatima. Thank you so much. First, I would like to express my great happiness for the invite I got to attend this precious conference. I'd like to thank Dr. Hamada, the head of communication at Qatar University, and Dr. Muhammad Mukhtar Al-Khalil for having invited me. Now I'll speak about my research for this conference about the aspects of ideological polarization between Muslims and Hindus on TikTok. I'm going to present you with a video to present my main ideas. But I'm going to speak in Arabic. I hope interpretation is working. It comes to Hindus and Muslims polarization. يا الله راح ننطوش اليوم. يا الله سامعة الصوت والوين؟
Have to understand the catalyst of that violence was because of the propaganda pushing by the British or the British rule at the time of divide and conquer. They did not want Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs to live together in peace. And what they did was exactly the same thing that they did in Israel, where they started this narrative of hatred between the Arabs as well as the Jews, as well as other ethnic minorities.
How about India? Muslim girls are being prevented from wearing hijab while attending their Quran classes.
So as you saw, these are the four main categories for the conflict between the two communities on TikTok. So there was instigation for violence, hatred, and confrontation. The second content is that of coexistence, entente, dialogue. And the third one is calling for wisdom, explanation, in a logical way, and going back to credible sources. And last, what's related to community and social matters, love, friendship, marriage. So I dealt with this content. This is what we're going to start seeing right now. I will try to identify the mechanisms that were used by the content producers from both communities to show their narrative, and I will see how this was affected by the tension between the two communities and if there are links between the characteristics of the interactive platform and the content being promoted. So we rely on the standpoint theory, which analyzes feminist narratives to see how to look at women through a certain ideological lens and identifying mechanisms of power and hegemony that every party is relying on when they justify their upper hand or their upper right to exist. So every party has its own basis that they premise their own narrative and discourse for their cause on, and it is in confrontation with the others. So they have the bigger right to exist. So these are ideological pillars for the content producers to create and structure their message. And then we have the mixed approach of both quantitative and qualitative analysis, and it tries to go through the four phases: the coding of the content segments, to construct concepts, third, categorization, and then generating types, while also resorting to quantitative analysis tools in order to come up with some extra content. I've analyzed more than 100 participations of both Hindus and Muslims, and I used the Hindu and Muslim hashtag in order to research them between September 2021 and December 2022. And I focused on analyzing other categories, not only Muslims and Hindus, but also other categories. The most important findings regarding the main ideas of that content or those reels. I wasn't talking about hate speech, instigation, or fake news that will be dominating. I never thought that, because most TikTok users are young people who are still optimistic, who look forward to a brighter future. The hate speech did exist, but the more dominant speech was that of coexistence and tolerance. For instigation and hate, 5%, coexistence and dialogue, 17%, love, friendship and marriage, 14%, peace and unity, 4%, explanation is 20%. It was one of the components that got more than 100,000 likes, and that was an exception. So it was very clear that there was an encouragement of that type of content. But as I mentioned, the mechanisms of work of TikTok, historical knowledge 8 and call for wisdom 5. Now the interaction was either through likes, through comments and participation. What was most liked was explanation and illustration, more than 100,000 likes for this kind of videos or reels. But most users like everything. But intensifying the likes on one content is not for everything. It's more for explanation and illustration. The most frequently used hashtags were hashtag Muslim and hashtag Hindu. And this means that polarization still exists, because Muslims focus on themselves when they present their causes. They would write Islam, Islamophobia, and everything Islam related. The same goes for the Hindus, Hinduism, etc. So the idea of polarization and the use of hashtags is very is manifesting itself very clearly. So the page that is mostly used by both Hindus and Muslims. India, Islam, Hindu, Muslim, UK. Why UK? It was the period of my research was when tensions increased in India due to some attacks by the Hindus on Muslim mosques, and it had echoed around the world, but it echoed mostly in the UK. And there were clashes between Indians and Pakistanis, not Hindus and Muslims only, but mostly between Indians and Pakistanis. That's why the hashtag UK was used in most videos. Also, when it comes to TikTok users, they use the hashtag viral, TikTok, and Daisy, which represents Southeast Asia. So they use it when it comes to coexistence, as well as other hashtags. So the emojis that were used, they were used along with love, friendship, everything emotional, marriage, heart, double hearts, everything related to men and women. This truly represents a very thorny issue, the band love between Hindus and Muslims, a female or a male Muslim and a female or male Hindu. But what's most used is social content, so most images are related to love and respect. However, a lot of videos in reality, or most of them, were without emojis. Fifth, the musical and visual effects or characteristics, the internal video shooting, people shooting from inside their homes against external shooting or outdoors, or they would get a video from a film and the movies. Most videos use the natural voice of humans, and then it was followed by silent videos and then a lot of lip sync and such videos. And amongst the types of music, most of them were without music, but those who used music used Indian songs or Islam anashid to confirm or to further anchor this idea of polarization between the two categories. Generally speaking, in terms of the volume of polarizing content was 32% and 55% for the content supporting coexistence, and 13% for the neutrals. Last but not least, 3 findings. The TikTok mechanism works automatically on giving a priority to the aesthetic effects rather than the content. So social media works on visual interaction and visual attraction rather than a sensible or logical dialogue. All social media accounts or social media platforms. A simple example is an Indian girl bears the banner, Pakistan didn't kill my father, it was the war that killed it. So she was saying that the war is a choice that we can decide not to make. The reply was, yes, Hitler didn't kill people, it was the war, so they were trying to undermine her. And it was this specific comment, when they add such pictures or emojis, that they get more likes. So the coexistence supporting content is bigger than other contents. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fatima. This research good idea about TikTok, and maybe we will go towards TikTok after the end of the session, especially that encourages a lot of explanation, etc. And this is such a noteworthy finding. Thank you once again, Dr. Fatima. I now move to the third speaker. It is clear that 10 minutes are not enough. So we're going to grant 15 minutes to the speakers. And Dr. Winston will speak to us about the scramble of big text for the Global South and its ramifications. He's a course leader of the Media and Development MA, a member of the top-rated communication research institutes at the University of Westminster, the UK. You have the floor, Dr. Mano. شكرا جزيلا. أود أن أشكر
Director General of Al Jazeera, Director of Al Jazeera Center of Studies, Head of Mass Communication, Professor Amada at Qatar University, and also my good friend, the Dean, Professor Miladi. I can go on, but thank you for the invitation. I want to focus my talk on the big techs, who are the sort of infrastructure behind most of what is wrong, what we are talking about. Is it good? So this came, if you want to read more about it, it's a chapter in a book called Media Ownership in Africa. But I have also other ideas that I want to expand to make it more a global South focus. Yeah? But what I want to put forward, a few ideas. I didn't mean to make a PowerPoint presentation, but I just thought it's important that we focus our eyes on something when I'm talking. But at the end of the day, I would like to argue for what I call a new relational accountability between the big technology companies and the global South context where they operate. And this builds on what we have heard since morning, a request for justice, a request for new norms, a request for new ethics, better participation. And this region has seen, for example, some of the othering that occurred during the football games. For example, there were so many questions in the Western media about how Qatar came to host this. And most of the questions are never asked when it's hosted elsewhere. So a lot of people, and if in the media in the West, they were like, are we being fair? Are we asking the right question? So we always need to ask that. But for me, what is really important from these incidences of othering is that colonialism is not over, as Walter Mignolo advises us. So colonialism is still with us in today's world. Yeah? It's not over, he argues, but it's all over. Yeah? So that's why we find it in things like football. But I want to focus my frame on decolonizing the techs, particularly the big technology companies. And what I'm saying here is not, it's building on, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, it's building on other work that has been going on. People have talked about digital dependencies, people have talked about how the global South is left out, de-Westernizing, internationalizing, globalizing, decolonizing, Southernizing. But at the moment, we are talking about something else. There's what is called, algorithmic colonization. Some people are talking about data colonization. I'm more interested in a new relational accountability. I'm coming in from the lens of decoloniality, and I'm also emphasizing on something called re-lexicalizing, or changing the way we talk or perceive these big technology companies. I'm arguing that there is a way in which there could be a pluriverse where we have, different technological opportunities and systems working side by side, and people working in a mutually respectable position. So when you're looking at, the way I'm looking at this, I'm aware that in our field, for example, in media and communication, there are some frameworks that have been very useful, but I'm thinking that we should disturb and disrupt. Yeah? For example, I'm borrowing from anthropological lenses, talking about what I call eating and being eaten. Yeah? If, for example, you use some of the common kind of vocabulary to look at how these technology companies could be seen as wanting to eat, and also our stance as people in the global south, as people who would want to benefit from this new technological development. And if we argue that, this idea of eating and being eaten is the order of, life in today's world, there are some moral, developments that require us to be more respectable and to develop what we call mutual, relationships that would make this relationship of eating up rivals and enemies and making a meal of others, much more palatable. Yeah? It requires new ethics. It requires new kind of accountabilities. So what do we mean by big techs? These are big information technology companies such as Meta, Amazon, Apple, and Netflix, Alphabet. They exist, as we heard since morning. They exist in our lives. They are touching a lot of what we do. But the real problem is that in the global south, which I use very loosely, I know there are also countries in the global south like China, which people can feel are not really victims, but they are also sending their own techs out. But what we can look at the global south is as a site of struggle, as a site which is formally colonized, as a responsive digital ecosystem that is vulnerable to these big technology information companies. These technology companies, the debates are not new. For example, we have had a lot of quarrels with the global north in the global south. Yeah? I think you remember the report called Many Voices, One World by Sean McBride. This report, for example, emphasized how these privately owned organizations can wield a lot of power, sometimes more than governments. Yeah? And these technology companies are clearly what McBride was referring to in 1980. Yeah? They have become so powerful. And the concentration is problematic. It can defeat public interest. It means sometimes what we care about, diversification and avoiding hate speech and other things, can become problematic. It also reinforces this idea that imperialism has not ended. Yeah? When you look at the area of technologies, imperialism continues. What has just changed is the form. It's evolving. So when you look at high-tech goods, since 1960, some researchers have said that we have lost about $152 million to the global north, and this is now including the high-tech goods. It's a lot of money, and these asymmetrical relations, they have victims. Yet it's a time where there could be development opportunities as a result of these new technologies. They are what people call digital dividends, the kind of synchronization that you can get from the industries, some making hardware, some making software, employment arising. But I'm saying when you look at the global south, where there are so many needs, where there are, for example, young people, if you look at the median age in Africa, 19.7%. If you look at Asia, 32, If you look at Europe, it's a much older kind of profile. So there are a lot of needs within the global south, I would argue. And when you look at regions like Africa, the demographic is pointing to the use of these technologies, these digital dividends, as potentially of impact to provide e-commerce, jobs, and other things. There is a lot of policy framework which is trying to point to this, yet these are not, these are not yet, available to the global south. I also want to be very clear that I'm not saying everything from the global north is harmful, or everything from the global south is good, but we need to be critical. As my colleague Bruce Mtairo was saying, we are not here to talk about the good things. We are here to raise concerns and to point to what is not working. So these big techs, I'm arguing in this presentation that they are caving out, they are scrambling, they are caving out the world, amongst themselves. Yeah? It's part of what they call planetarization of capital. These technology companies, they are looking at the global south as a new extractive zone where they enhance their capital. This is a very funny picture by a Kenyan cartoonist. I don't know whether you see it. As you see on the other side, it's a picture from it's representing what happened in 1884. I know it's a picture, somewhere we're arguing that maybe he got this one wrong. This is Stalin, he was not there in 1884. But what you see on the other side is more important, where you have, for example, companies like Apple, Samsung, meeting in Berlin. It's a second Berlin where, again, they are dividing amongst themselves, the spoils of what we have as the global, south and the rest of the world. The global south is attractive because it's resource rich. It's also young, like I say. But also one of the points at the bottom there is that there are fewer laws and regulation, which leaves the continent, more vulnerable to these new players. And what we have also, when I say these young populations that are holding these devices increasingly, is a new gold. The data that is being harvested, processed by this, it's like the gold, the oil of the past. Data is capital, data is the new gold, and like oil and gold before it, data is power, and like all forms of power, it is being deployed in political spaces. As we speak, for example, there's been an election in Nigeria, and one wonders, what was the use of AI, what was the use of algorithms in that election, yeah? Because we have had previous reports of, what happened in Kenya, in Nigeria itself, where Cambridge Analytica, for example, was implicated. So when we are talking about these big techs and their insertion in the global south, we are talking of a new stage of capitalism, according to Cowdery and Mejias. It's a new form of colonization, which is predatory, exploitative, dependence-inducing, extractive in relations. But it's also much more worrying, appropriating human life through data in ways that are, very problematic. It's colonizing, our lived experience, yeah? And at the moment, because of lack of regulation in the global south, we are seeing a very worrying kind of trend. Why do I say there's a scramble? Some of you may have said, that word is unkind. If you look at since 2015, we have the captains of big techs, for example, Airbnb's Brian Chesky going to Africa, Microsoft's boss, Satya Nadella, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, he has visited Africa not once, twice or more. Google's boss, Sundar Pichai, has been, Alphabet, Twitter, you can go on, And there's been a beeline, one can argue, to go into Africa. And when you look at Jack Dorsey, what he said is that For example, when you look at these new kind of environments, like in Africa, in Asia, in MENA, these are, very important for their future. Yeah? He said, for example, Africa would define the future. Yeah? What did he mean by that? Yeah? At the same time, we have rivalry between, countries in the global south to attract the most, big techs to to themselves. For example, in Africa, when Google set up its AI lab, it set it up in Ghana. And the South Africans were very sulky. Yeah? They said, we needed this. Even if they had come, we were not going to charge them any taxes. Yeah? To have it will benefit the rest of the continent. But the truth of the matter is, when I examined the discussions around these investments, most of them are sales offices. Yeah? Most of them are not producing anything. There is need for a new relational accountability where the big techs, they are meaningfully present in collaborations that would be mutually beneficial. So this data colonialism is as problematic to the global north as it is to the global south. Cowdery talks about external and internal kind of colonialism. Within the global north, like they also are problematic. They are being asked to pay hefty fines. They are also They are also being called digital gangsters, and they are also facing a lot of regulation. There is worry that these big techs are actually causing a lot of, they are abusing their dominance. They are adopting and offboarding startups, and they are disrupting the digital dividends and strategies in the global south to develop anything meaningful. I'll give you an example. This company called Andela, it recruited 400 junior developers across Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria. Then in a short time, they offloaded them in 2014, yeah? And most of them did not find any jobs after that. Yeah? Then you also have the idea that they are dominating advertising, and they are also buying up any competition. In North Africa, Karim, for example, which was a competition to Uber, was bought, 3.1 billion, to consolidate Uber's dominance. So what we have, therefore, are systems that are emerging, which are very much taking over, dominating, and disrupting any innovation and insertion that those in the global south would want. So what we have, therefore, is capture. It's also, I will mention this, is the idea that the techno-philanthropy that is emerging is also problematic. You all know Facebook Free Basics. It was banned in India because it violates net neutrality. It means a person's... So what has happened is that this program has developed unnoticed in Africa. So there are a lot of examples of this. We also have examples of big tech's monopolistic tendencies available in different ways. In film, for example, crowding out local film and TV. So what I'm saying, this is my last slide, I'm moving to my last year, is that from our vantage point as people in the global south, we need to ask questions, yeah? We need to share experiences. We need to revisit policy frameworks. There is a problem of exceptionalism. We need to think about, what works for us. This is my last slide. In my own work, I will talk about Afroecology in another presentation. I'm thinking of how we should think about new ethics, accountability, and relationships in ways that are informed by our own ideas within where we live in the global south. Thank you very much.
إذا هذا التدافع في حقيقته هو حالة استعمارية يتم خلالها إنتاج المنطق الاستعماري يقدم مصالح عدد قليل من الشركات على مصالح دول العالم في الجنوب. أنتقل إلى
have their interests before the interests of the global south countries. Now to Dr. Nuruddin Miladi, who is also a reference on the matter. He has more than 40 research papers on media and communication, and he is going to present a research on the war on the Palestinian narrative containing or obstructing Palestinian content on social media platforms. You have the floor, Dr. Nuruddin Miladi. Thank you. In the name of God, peace be upon you. I thank Al Jazeera Center for Studies. I thank our colleagues and the media section for this exceptional work. It has opened a very good new chapter for the academic collaboration between Al Jazeera Center for Studies and Qatar University. Our thanks and appreciation to the audience. Hope that all this is of academic benefit to all. I'm going to speak briefly about the paper brief on what I call the war on the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian discourse. How the Palestinian content is being obstructed, undermined, contained on the social media platforms. It's a joint work between myself and one of my female colleagues who unfortunately for health reasons couldn't be here, Anwar Al-Urfi. So it is a hopefully continuous effort that will be published and that I am overseeing, a global media coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That's its title. And accordingly, I took a special study about Sheikh Jarrah events in May 2021. So hopefully it could be an added value to the academic library on how the media works, be it visual, audio, or social media platforms, and depicting or at least conveying the Palestinian narrative. And we took a number of comparisons, be it between countries and the different platforms. So this paper is inspired from this effort that I have made, and it shall be published in July by Bloomsbury Editores. To speak about the Palestinian discourse and its obstruction or undermining as part of a continuous conflict that started in 1948 and even before that. So it took different forms, including armed conflict. However, there's a conflict at other levels by Israelis or its Western supporters, or by the Arabs and Palestinians, everyone supporting the Palestinian narrative. So it moved from an armed conflict, then diplomatic struggle, and then political. There are different forms to it. But what happened in the last few years is this quantum leap towards a conflict in the digital or virtual world of space. And this became a real exceptional resistance weapon or tool, which greatly gave momentum to the Palestinian cause. What we saw in the Sheikh Jarrah area events in May 2021 in terms of support only from the Western context, both European and American, we would conclude, even the Latin American one, we would conclude this increased support to the Palestinian cause. Part of this production is this electronic active efforts on social media. And this is where the idea of the obstruction came, because the support was represented by the young people, the young people's category. A lot of the demonstrations that broke out in London and other European capitals and even in the United States were led by the youth, many of whom are Jewish, not necessarily Arabs, Muslims, or Asians. So we can speak here about a real boom. The questions of this research are many, but I'm going to focus on the strategy to counter the Palestinian narrative, since we don't have much time. So I'm going to speak in flashes and or briefly, that is. And you will see further elaboration on these questions in the research when it is published. Undoubtedly, focusing on this phenomenon comes from Manuel Castell's talk and the talk of other colleagues this morning, which is the increased presence in the virtual or digital sphere of users around the world, and increasingly so, especially in the social media platforms. So many statistics were mentioned. There are statistics that take us back to the Arab world or to other worlds. But part of the work that we have conducted with the colleagues funded by the Qatar Fund for Scientific Research, we have concluded some very important findings we are living through in our world in Qatar, but they were further documented by the field study we've conducted, and which showcases the following. So there is a large number of the youth below 35 years of age are not watching TV. The main content for the news they rely on is social media platforms through sound bites, short tweets, without going too deep. So that's the truth. The main source of information, of any sort of information that is almost social media platforms. So these results, these findings are important for decision makers, family members or parents, and most importantly, educators and teachers in both different institutes and universities. So here we speak about the importance of electronic presence in order to resist or to counter any sort of corruption or to support any cause. So the Sheikh Jarrah events in 2021 in May witnessed for the first time a war, I will use the term war, against Palestinian content. As we mentioned, this doesn't come out of the blue. It was almost as impactful as the missiles sent out by the Qassam brigade from Gaza and others to the Israelis, or against the Israelis. What happened on the digital sphere was a real war, but this time through the use of very important questions. And the researchers like us should delve deeper into these phenomena and take a lot of studies. In terms of the methodology we've adopted, we are trying to gather the qualitative and the quantitative, and we have to go back to framing. On the first part, we were trying to analyze the content of a large number of platforms. First, restricting, and second, removing. So it is a very systematic approach. It is not done arbitrarily inside and outside Palestine. What's happening regarding social media around the world is through the same mechanisms, through the same tools or means, actually. It starts with the restriction for a certain period of time. So the examples we've seen in the table identify quickly this content. But if we look at the research published in English and in Arabic, we would find a large content that identifies the obstruction of Palestinian content. Let's look at what we have on the screen. It briefly presents what was closed down since 2021 in line with what's happening with Sheikh Jarrah events. So 600 Palestinian accounts were removed. This was documented by some platforms. We know that in Gaza and the West Bank, there's a lot of efforts by the civil society. They're doing a tremendous job in following up on this phenomenon. So we notice the historical context that is on the rise and that has taken multiple manifestations. First, the use of legal frameworks under the pretense of objectivity, under the pretense that this content goes against public taste, or that it bears hate or violent speech, or under the pretense of protecting the viewers. All this under the pretense of objectivity. That's how the other party frames it or portrays it. The second part is a restriction or even a prohibition without any justification. Some examples related to the prohibition or restriction. Let's talk about the reporting examples. And this is another phenomenon adopted by the other party. Even reporting the restriction is also restricted. So you want to report that your account has been restricted, but you cannot reach the other party because reporting it is removed. Even the users do not understand or do not notice that the restriction or the prohibition happened and that some people have expressed grievances thereon.
Another component, or these are two components only. We are talking here. I still have 2 minutes, okay. And I am the last speaker, and therefore I should get enough time, right, Mrs. Moderator? So, promptly, I would like to address the structures for hostilities here. First, the structure that is forming this control, which is a natural output to control wealth, to control the public opinion, and second, actions and specifically the control online. So this control or censorship online is a continuation of what Palestinians are living within their borders, be that in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and other countries. So this is reflecting, so what's happening in the virtual world is reflecting what is happening is reflecting what's happening on the virtual world. However, this time this is not happening symbolically, but actually. So this confrontation is open now. The disintegration that took place and the attack against the Palestinian content took place because the Palestinians were able, through their content, to change this Israeli narrative activists in Palestine and in the Arab world are debunking the Israeli narrative of what's happening. This is why the May 2021 war was a totally different one, in which the Palestinian narrative dominated and prevailed. The Palestinian content imposed itself in this narrative and story. As a conclusion, we can say that the concept of conflict in the Palestinian context has drastically changed, especially with the boom of social media platforms. The example that I mentioned about Sheikh Jarrah street and what happened there has affected the content within and without Palestine and even inside the Israeli context. Thank you, Mr. Nuruddin. For the sake of Palestine, I would have loved to grant you more time. However, we have a tight schedule. I would like to thank you for this important paper. There are two main issues of interest, which is digital aggression and how to combat it. Once again, I would like to thank you, Mr. Nuruddin, and I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Kindly be concise in your questions in order to use this time to get answers to your questions. Good afternoon. I would like to thank the panelists for their valuable and enriching inputs. My question is to Mr. Nuruddin, who talked about and below are no longer reading and aware of any robust content that gives a clear idea about what's happening. Generation will be even less interested in the content, and we know that we are not known to be people who love reading. So would we think that this conventional world would be extinct, given that most people now take to TikTok and to other similar platforms? Hello. My question is to Mr. Guy. You talked about hate speech. Can there be a methodology agreed upon by an entity that is responsible for a specific question and media outlets that would forge a frame to have a hate speech that is competing with the first party? So can we have people who have a certain My question is allow me first to start by thanking you for the presentations that are of high level and enriching, in my opinion. I have a point that I would like to talk on about TikTok and dangerous, because in your explanation, in your content, as you are trying to explain a question or a cause, this is laying on the basis of the ideology that you have. So the idea would be a description or a depiction of an issue based on the person's ideology. So how is it possible to... be on the safe side and to fight the expansion of TikTok, namely that most of cannot combat topics like polarization or monopoly. Dr. Raji, thank you, Mrs. Fatima As-Samadi. I would like to thank the panelists for their interesting presentations. My question is similar to what Mr. Muhammad Al-Bouzidi has asked. In relation to the conclusions of Mrs. Fatima Zahra stating that 51% of the users who tend to have dialogue about Muslim Hindu issues, and that 17%, if I recall well in her presentation, and the levels of polarizations were medium to low. So the question is, there might not be this high significance here because if we give the analogy of a kitchen knife, we know that the kitchen knife could be used as a tool to cut things out. So what can you say regarding the conclusions that you reached in your presentation? أشكر الجميع على العروض.
But anyway, my question is addressed to Professor Berger. I very much like your understanding and interpretation of the laws of hate speech of expression. And the question is, how can we free the regulation or laws governing internet from the hegemony of those international companies that, of course, try to impose its philosophy and interests upon the regulatory framework that govern and administer the platforms of social media internet.
إذا كان بالإمكان أن أضيف
Allow me here to add to Mr. Basuni's questions another one of my own, maybe one related to what he said. Mr. Gieberger talked about a systematic hate speech. Are the current efforts to combat hate speech worldwide also a systematic approach? I will take another final question before giving the floor to the panelists. شكرا على الفرصة. اسمي هناء وأنا طالبة دولية قادمة من الهند، لذلك أجد أن عرض الدكتورة فاطمة ملفت للغاية. أود أن أشكرها على النظر في مسألة الاستقطاب الإيديولوجي بين المسلمين والهندوس على منصة تيك توك. سؤالي الأول من
you're so kind of far off, and it's very rare to see people researching such topics. But another point that I wanted to point out is that I came last year. I'm new to Qatar, so we didn't really have TikTok for a very long time. And something that I noticed from your the video presentation and data was that most TikTok videos, they came from NRIs or non-resident
I'm sorry to, excuse me, I'm sorry. I should interrupt you because I should back to our speakers. So if you have any points, we can discuss this later with Dr. Fatima Az-Zahra. May I? Okay.
So basically, only within India, interfaith marriages, especially by religious, they kind of target the minorities, and it's actually a big problem. They're not allowed. So that's why that's my main point. I would like
تعلق
Mano.
بإشارته
In the face of big techs, are there any suggestions in this respect? The digital resistance. Are we talking here about a systemic digital resistance? And maybe the questions raised about TikTok lead us to talk about users of these platforms and the terms of use in such platforms that could affect how users use these platforms. So we start with Mr. Berger to answer the questions. شكرا. سوف أحاول الإجابة على هذه الأسئلة الثلاثة من خلال المزج بينها.
That can be agreed and then not used in a political way against people who are not doing hate speech in the narrow sense. So the different companies, Instagram, TikTok, even WhatsApp and so on, they have different policies. They have the way they understand hate speech and present it is different, and often it's very vague, which means that it's hard to enforce a policy if it's too broad. And the other problem is that they don't link their definition of hate speech to the international human rights law, which would enable them to see when these expressions of hate are jeopardizing what rights. So, when the expressions of hate speech that's about violence is, it's about people's right to safety, right to life. And I think if the companies were to try and orientate and integrate more their policies to human rights, I think that would make it a bit more concrete for them to rule on it. And then, of course, there are all these issues about how they interpret and how they apply, if they train their human moderators properly, but then, as I said, the problem is with AI. And so I do think that the biggest thing is really to get them to take more seriously that the content on their platforms can lead to real dangers to human rights, such as peace, survival, and so on, especially when it comes to hatred. And for that, they need to be forced coming up because they have the big data and they can begin to see when there's expressions of identity that are being mixed with expressions of discrimination or hostility or violence. I mean, they can do big data analysis so they can see when it's becoming dangerous. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the issue as well. These companies tend to have global policies, and then some countries have regulated. So the companies don't ban Nazi propaganda in their policies. They don't treat that as inherently hate speech because they come from Silicon Valley. And in California, there's historically not been a huge danger from the Nazis. But what happened was that when Germany looked at this laissez-faire kind of policy, they said, no, in Germany you have to ban Nazi content. So different countries were trying to deal with these broad generic policies with specific rules. And now you come to the question, though, of the particular country and its ruling party there has got these cyber troops of lots and lots of well-organized trolls to foster hatred against Muslims in India, basically. And that polarization can have very serious consequences, as was mentioned. And I think that raises the question then, okay, so in Germany, you know, they said no Nazi propaganda on services in Germany. But what about governments that are actually involved in fomenting hatred? I mean, do you want them to start regulating, because it might even be worse then? And in fact, in India, there is a new regulation which says that anybody who's unhappy with content on the internet can go to a government committee, and the government committee will decide if the company must keep the content or take it down. But it's a government committee. There's no independence there. It's not even an independent regulator appointed by the... What can people do in a case like that? And that's where I think this idea of multi-stakeholder participation becomes very important, that in India, academics, trade unions, media, religious groups have to assert themselves so that it's not a government committee just making these decisions on its own, because really that is going to be, I think, a recipe for even an increase of hate speech there. So this partially relates to the question of Prof. About the hegemony of these big internet companies. I think that they are so big, it needs a combined effort. So you need these global efforts at the UN. You need regional efforts like at the European Union. You need national efforts where you have national efforts. And when I was doing research for this UNESCO conference, I was reading Meta's filings they have to do, because they're a listed company in the US. So that means they have to file a report frequently there. And when you read these, they are very sensitive to press coverage, for example. I mean, not that it forces them to do completely the right thing, but they do pay attention. And I think bringing together those pressures, regulation in some countries, regulation in some regions, and at the same time, there are two other questions that are at stake. The one is the size of these companies, because they are so powerful. You know, as you can see now with Meta, it's one person who makes the decision, final decision. At Twitter, one person. I mean, so the power for them to be very abusive is enormous, and they report to nobody. So people are saying we need to really find ways to reduce this power, that they have to break their companies into smaller pieces. Whether that will happen, I don't know, because they spend a lot of money on lobbying and and sponsorships and such is the cause of the problems. But I think if they're broken up, that could help. And then privacy regulation will also weaken their power to make money and manipulate people towards, as I said, to nudging people bit by bit towards hatred and polarization. If they can't invade privacy and collect all the data, then I think that will also
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السؤال الأول من الدكتور محمد البوزيدي
Mr. Muhammad Al-Buzaidi about contextual framing and how to deal with the TikTok content, given that the youth are the more likely to react negatively to TikTok. This is if I understood your question correctly, sir. So you're talking about the contextualization itself. Regarding the word danger or risks, this is something I do not appreciate using for social media platforms. We should not define them as dangerous or non-dangerous. We need to be able to have mechanisms to deal with them. What we have, or the problematic is, we have lack of media literacy and lack of national security conditions. So these are the two problems that lead people to be more negatively influenced by such content. And these two conditions have to be met. For instance, say today there is a recommendation by the White House to ban TikTok in the US, and we have seen that it is bad. It was banned also in India. India, Pakistan, Canada, and other countries banned it. Why? Because there are some national security requirements that apply here. However, the situation is different in our countries. Raising awareness of people and providing them with media literacy or education would lead to better use of these media. And it would prevent looking at them as a dangerous means used to raise awareness that could have never been achieved by any other media outlet. So TikTok was used to describe Sheikh Jarrah's event in the best way possible. Now, regarding the question of Dr. Muhammad Al-Raji, that the means itself or the outlet itself doesn't have this halo, and in relation to the conclusions and the outcomes of my study, yes, I would say that these mechanisms are used to create the content. This is a contextual platform. This is not just a video that is posted on Instagram or TikTok. Twitter is the same. However, for TikTok, it's only about videos. So this is the difference between TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, and so forth. When watching the videos, usually the brain freezes. And sometimes what happens is that we close our eyes when watching a movie in order for us to go back into our mind and understand visuals. We need to also take in or bear in mind the content itself. You cannot express any cause that you have or a certain belief or faith that you have through mechanisms that this platform could provide. بالنسبة لسؤال
Interesting question. You know, this could be one of the limitations of this study, because I didn't have any clue how to know the residency of the residency location of the users who produced these videos. But yes, I think most of them are mainly based in UK or outside India, but was not shown in the results of my search with the hashtag Hindu and Muslim. Of course, if we look at Facebook or Twitter, we can find different results. But it's, you know, every research has its limitations, and it could be one of the limitations of this study. Thank you.
دكتور نور الدين.
شكرا جزيلا. المايك يسمع. هل الفكر العربي معرض للانقراض؟ سؤال سألته الأخت على يمين القاعة. هو السؤال الذي يطرح هل أن الفكر
The question is about rather the extinction of the human mind. Is artificial intelligence in a way that artificial intelligence will replace the human mind? This is a challenge, especially with the emergence of ChatGPT and other like platforms. And there is a challenge here in the creation of content. This is a challenge to academics, to research centers, to media outlets, which could do without a large number of journalists in the future, since this application could create a very valuable media or journalist content. And the issue here is not an issue related to the Arab world, it's rather a global issue, because part of what you are reading in the Asian or American context in relation to a global issue. So I believe that the human being will not allow a machine to control the human with digitalized determinants. Machines are not the agents. Machines evolve and develop because the human being created them and developed them based on their needs, and it's not the other way around. Now, regarding digital resistance and whether it is systematic, I believe that by following up on what was happening, for instance, the Arab Spring movement and the use of the Arab youth of social media platforms, and in any resistance to corruption, to dictatorship, and in defense of human rights and the freedom of expression. And if we and in the Palestinian context, we cannot say that they are organized. Part of the success of the Arab Spring is that it is not systematic. It was created and led by the street itself, and this is partly the reason behind its success. And this was successful because what happened in Palestine was not created by any political party or by any affiliations. The same applies to the issue of Kurds, for instance, which have created a phenomenon. And for Palestine, this or what's happening when it comes to digital content, they call it the daughter of Jerusalem, trying to defend the Palestinian narrative. The lady and her brother, Noor and her brother, I watched her content in English and Arabic, and they speak about the Palestinian narrative in a beautiful manner. And the success, again, as I said, lies in the fact that this was not a systematic effort. Now, regarding TikTok, the use of Twitter, Instagram, and so forth, they were used by an individual initiative. Their influence was greater because of that. And the West has a stereotyped opinion about Palestinians. They do not accept the narrative of the armed groups in Palestine, whether it comes from the authority or the main political parties in Palestine. So this unorganized movement in Palestine, we see it. We see even that it has been influencing the Arabs as well. So again, I would say it is successful because it was not organized. I have a question on the imperialism of data and information rather, and that in the South we do not produce information but we consume them. How can we combat electronic information or information production? شكرا.
Your information about the lack of laws in these countries and what can be done about it in order to make the situation favorable for the global. But it's also the interpretation and enforcement of laws and like what we call the sanctions, yeah? If something goes wrong, do some of the countries in the global south have the ability or teeth to fine or to take measures against infringement? At the moment, you find that ability, that muscle exists in some of the countries, but not in all. For example, in South Africa, they had developed a government chart which enabled poor citizens to communicate about social relief, distress grants, and this application was using WhatsApp. It was working all good until 2020. WhatsApp realized that, oh, we are doing large volume communication on behalf of the South African government. Then they decided to offboard it. And then the Competition Commission in South Africa said, no, according to your regulations and our regulations, you are not supposed to do that. So they wanted to penalize Facebook and WhatsApp 10% of their gross income because they had violated the the existing regulations. But this example, and also the banning of Facebook free basics in India for violating net neutrality. But however, this facility which was banned in India, it has gone on to develop without any hindrance. Even some countries that were not initially approached by Facebook have willingly accepted Facebook free basics, yeah, as an idea of getting their citizens connected. But it raises a number of problems because of the e-commerce, or because of the idea of limited internet horizon for citizens. So in a way, I want to say that in order to create spaces of information that is of quality to its citizens, we need to, I agree with my colleague, I don't have to repeat, my colleagues talked about the need for stakeholders to widen those who are involved in the regulation. We need not to leave it to just the government. We need to have, also I added that we need to include lessons and examples of what has worked, what has not worked from each other's countries, yeah, so that we can strengthen the regulation and experience about these big techs. But because what is motivating them is not necessarily the public utility idea of the internet. What is motivating them are profits, and they're accountable to their shareholders. And when they approach us, they are extractive. They are thinking about where the next profit is coming, and their outlook is not necessarily. If it coincides with national interest, that's good. But in most cases, it's at odds with national interest. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا على تحملكم هذه.
We would like to thank you for your patience during this long session. Allow me to close this session by thanking Mr. Burgers, Mrs. Fatima, Mr. Winston Mano, Mr. Nuruddin. And allow me to remind you that tomorrow's sessions will start at 9. And we hope you would bear with us longer to launch Al Jazeera for Communication and Media Studies Journal. The first volume is already published. It adds to the publications of the Al Jazeera Center for Studies and other platforms. I call upon Mr. Al Khalil, the head of Al Jazeera Center for Studies, to launch the journal.
(2023). Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and
journal. Al Jazeera has a long experience in knowledge production and content production after 30 years of service, and we wanted to institutionalize this content by launching this journal. We found out that a number of journals in the Arabic language do not give specific attention to media experience. Most of the magazines or journals are associated with some media outlets. So if we in the Jazeera Center for Studies wanted to dedicate publications for the journalist and media experience. We noticed that there aren't many studies and material regarding the media experience. And we hope that the journal will be able to address this issue. Another problematic is that a large number of audience that are interested in Al Jazeera publications are not exactly accustomed to Al Jazeera producing this type of articles or publications. So this was another problematic or a challenge for us. We would like to thank you for being interested in this topic. And as we did in Lubab magazine or journal, we would like to say that ahead of our initial experience with Lubab, we were skeptical at first, but now we are very pleased after 5 years of publications. We would like to call upon you to continue writing and to contribute to Al-Baib and to do so for our current journal, the Communication and Media Studies Journal. I would like to thank you for your patience. I would like to thank Mr. Al-Raji, the editor, Mr. Nuruddin, who is the sub or deputy editor-in-chief. Thank you. Without further ado.
Polarization, power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and